We are Wednesday, the 1st of April, 2020, and this is our real first news update roundup of the cruise. I'm Craig Campbell, this is Jim Grant, and Jim's the chronologer, and I am the verbologer. And I'm going to offshoot some of the things I want to talk about with some of the things that Jim will bring up himself, I'm sure. So welcome to our show. If you're curious about what's going on in particularly COVID-19 land, as they like to call it, then some of this may be interesting to you.
I'm just going to close my windows because I smell burning. Not a great way to start the show, is it?
Yeah, before it's made legal.
Someone's probably had a bonfire outside.
Before it's made illegal,
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's outside. No need to panic.
Yeah, at first.
Yeah, no need to panic, huh?
It's a pretty handy way to get people out of buildings. Fire. Yeah. Pretty handy. I learned an expression from this outbreak. Early days, a wise soul on Twitter, a random, but real early in the game, like kind of, no later than mid-January, just said, if you're going to panic, it's best to do it early. Just like, yeah, you say what you want about panicking, but when you're doing it late, you just look like a retard, and that's where we're at. We're watching the Tory government present themselves as panicking late. Very odd.
It's interesting,
isn't it?
Should that dovetail into some of the first points that I want to make?
Yes, hit it. Yeah, tell me all about it. Where do you think we're at? It's again to repeat, first of April.
About why we do, well, at least why I'm doing this podcast and what I aim to cover.
Yeah,
this was something that you and I had claimed to try to do before the virus even broke out. We put a pilot episode in the bag of just like views on the world and everything like that. So now, we've got more time on our hands to do it more than ever.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to present was factual mainstream evidence that perhaps I don't see people talking about social media enough. It's out there. It's not a conspiracy theory.
No.
It's just pieces of news articles that perhaps put together, people might see things in slightly different pictures. And I wouldn't be here to say to listen to you or to me, but to do their own research. And I've compiled a load of articles. I emailed them over to you earlier.
Yeah.
I'll put them up on our Facebook page, which is Cruise, and my Jim Grant comedy page, for people to be able to, anything that we don't cover in this podcast, people can think for themselves, ask their own questions, and look into things themselves. So the first point I wanted to make, Craig, was we're under national lockdown, but the borders are still open.
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about that while I bring up, and to anyone watching this is completely unrehearsed. So we're not tech experts. So I'm going to bring up a couple of articles while I talk about them, while you give your views on that.
Sure, and if I can also give a synopsis of what you just said, is that we can also understand that we will also present what mainstream purports as fact. So it's like it's another set of facts, but we're using their building blocks. If they've vetted it, then we'll comment on it as such. As far as not stopping planes coming directly even from Wuhan, which most people aren't aware of, the last flight came in direct from Wuhan on the 29th of January. Again, a lot of, as Jim just said, a lot of this will come off the top of our heads, but I'm quite firm on this one. I believe also it was a Wednesday. And I think that the actual lockdown of Wuhan, that Jim will know abundantly, and a lot of people who follow this will know abundantly, involved, at least at that time, being the 22nd of January, at least 5 million escapees had happened from that point. So it's very hard to contextualize that even beyond the lockdown in Wuhan specifically, there were still direct flights going from Wuhan to Heathrow 3 times a day and molested in any way upon their entrance into the UK. Not even, I don't think, as now, at least the plane still coming direct from the COVID outbreak hotspots, including Italy and China and New York, these ones being the case. I think now they give you like a little pamphlet or something and tell you that you should probably stay at home if you got the sniffles for. Sorry, I'm being a bit facetious now. I believe the instruction, including here, Canada, and maybe the States, is along a similar line, that when you fly in from a COVID outbreak hotspot, they recommend that you self-isolate for 2 weeks. But prior to February, that wasn't even on the cards. You were just like, welcome from China. Hey, have you been to our Chinatown? Come on in, woo! And, that's not even accounting for the fact that, as mentioned, 5 million people had escaped from the Wuhan lockdown. That's now, in January 22nd, and had dissipated into other travel hubs of Asia. Not even considering that they just went to their neighbor's house in the neighboring province. The likelihood was that they got as far as Shanghai, which I think is only 400 or 500 clicks away in Chinese standards, infinitesimal. And that's before you think of the people that maybe even would have popped down, walked across the borders that were not being closed pointedly in Hong Kong or entering into Hong Kong. I think it actually took the threat of continued, because I was going to say threat of strike action, but I think they actually did initiate strike action, but there was a threat of continued strike action from the Hong Kong medical staff, including doctors and nurses, to actually further leverage the government to finally close the borders with mainland China, which they were reticent to do. So there's all kinds of reason to think that people from the Wuhan area would have not just got to Beijing or Shanghai or Hong Kong, but throughout China, to then go wherever they wanted, really, essentially. And that's not even to think of the specific threat.
Hello? Can you still hear me?
Yes, and that's not to mention even the specific threat of flying just directly from the UK or from Wuhan to the UK. So we're in a very at best a laughable lockdown, if the intention of the government is to actually lock down and close off contamination routes or access points.
So let me just back up what you're saying there. This is an article from the Mail Online. I'll also include articles from other news publications, because I'm aware that some people go, I'm not reading anything from the Daily Mail. Forgetting that journalists are people, and you get good and bad people, therefore you get good and bad journalists.
As you do information.
I don't write off anything that, rather than a publication per se that I go, I'm not going to listen to. I tend to look at other journalists and go, I like what he's done in the past, regardless of where he works, or I don't like it. But regardless, this is Chris Dyer, 22nd of March. And it's coronavirus chaos at UK borders as flights from Italy, China and Iran, the countries with the biggest coronavirus death tolls, continue to arrive, with up to 7,500 travellers entering Britain in a week.
I forgot it was Iran also.
Let me just read it so you can get an idea of the timeline of it. Flights carrying thousands of passengers from the worst hit coronavirus areas are still landing in Britain. Yeah. Passengers from Italy, China and Iran have arrived at Gatwick and Heathrow this week, even as the UK went into lockdown. So get it there.
Yeah.
So that's
you and I shouldn't go to the beach, and nobody should be in the Dales hiking about, and they've still got infection festivals arriving every day into the major hub airports. It's beyond absurd. It's anytime you see these sort of massive defiances of logic, we're back again in the Orwellian dialectic. That up is down and down is up, and no, that's not white, that's black. Are you crazy? Just being gaslit. You're being gaslit.
Speaking of the coronavirus still arriving, this is an article from the Evening Standard.
Oh, and may I interrupt? Hold the thought, Jim. Remember as well that what you've introduced is is multiple different strains of coronavirus arriving, right? Like, it's not just that the coronavirus is not merging as one. You're bringing all kinds of different known specific strains, and some more virulent than others. And particularly Italy's and Iran's, to my knowledge, have a similar strain and similar mortalities and catchfulness.
I think in future episodes we can go into reasons that Italy, I'm not sure about Iran, may have had a higher than usual mortality rate because their normal flu mortality rate was higher. But we can put that on in another episode. Hopefully, we'll do this once a week or something like that.
Yes, of course. And now I'm sure you're used to the expression. What's the term in Islam? God rest his soul, or when you say if you speak of Muhammad's name, what's the term? Like you exalt him if you say his name. Do you recognize that as a behavior?
You're not talking about the infamous Allah Akbar line, are you?
How does Allah Akbar translate specifically? No, peace be upon him. Muhammad, peace be upon him. You recognize that?
I've heard it, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that's like the kind of pattern of that speech. But I think from now on, Jim, when you speak of Iran's COVID statistics, now in future we always just have to say, but we don't know what's going on. It's just like a total black hole of any statistical reference point, isn't it? It's like, woo! You can make noises about what might be happening, but as far as like any logical breakdown, we're just in Never Neverland. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah,
speaking of the virus arriving in the UK,
yes,
this is an article from the Evening Standard, and
another trustworthy source.
Just trying to get the actual date on it. I think going from memory, it either hasn't loaded yet or it's not showing. But from memory, I think this was very recent, as in the last couple of days. So the headline reads: "Coronavirus testing kits heading to the UK found to be contaminated
with COVID-19.
It goes on, testing kits which headed to the UK have been found to be contaminated with coronavirus. The government has said it aims to boost the rate of tests to 25,000 every day by the end of April at the latest, and has asked private companies to help drive up test production. But one production firm, Luxembourg-based manufacturer Eurofins, told UK labs on Monday, today's Wednesday, that deliveries would be delayed as core parts had been contaminated with coronavirus, the Telegraph reported."
It couldn't be more laughable. It's just unbelievable. As soon as you were talking about it, it reminded me of something you have on your Facebook wall of the number of frontline medical staff, NHS staff, who have been treated, and it made me. At the time, I didn't have any water in my mouth, but I spit taked. I just like, oh Christ, of course, just another like laughable element of incompetence and lack of credibility of attacking whatever we're facing right now. It's incredible, and that's before I giggled to myself because I also knew, as I'm sure you know also, that. There's already rumors of, if not proof of NHS staff being threatened with dismissal if they disclose any issues with their supply issues. So it's just like, I believe that. It seems pretty rational. Almost any business would have that type of behavior associated with it or clause associated with it. But here you are now. They're being like or poorly equipped. It's the perfect storm. Not only are they poorly equipped, but they can't even talk about it. So it's just like we're just in this madness of clearly they're not being tested to any great degree. The tests are known compromised. These are the tests that are thought to work if they arrive not contaminated. That's before you even parse how many of them are effective and to what degree, and what are the false positives and false negatives that we keep hearing about? Is that associated with this test also, or is that only with the American tests that we know that to be the case with? How many times did you and I see all the way through late January, for sure all of February, Jim, when the reports coming out of China were multiple tests? How long did it take them to finally test everybody on the Diamond Princess? That took like nearly a month, didn't it? It was just like they were crawling through passengers. Every day you'd be there with bated breath. How many did they test overnight? 29, 42, like not many. And then there were the false negatives that went there, where they released people that they said were now cured or not holding the titers or the antibodies for COVID-19. They get put onto the transit system in Japan to go back to their home village, which they do, and then within a few days are found to actually be contagious again, or not just contagious, but have contracted again, which presumably makes them contagious again. That's not deeply studied, but it's a known foible of this. The idea, and I've seen it pointed out, and I don't know if you have, but at least with a couple of different seemingly competent medical doctors or people with background in medicine assessing the reliability of the test kits, and it's just at best been laughable. It almost appears that the ones that the Yanks first tried, the American-made ones, that they refused the CDC's offer. Was it the CDC that offered or the World Health Organization? My apologies. Offered, I believe, the U.S. CDC their test kits, whichever lineage they're from, maybe from China also, to the Yanks, who refused them. And I think you and I talked about this before, where the Yanks refused them for a test that tested for multiple viruses, 3 in fact. So it's a much more comprehensive swab. And then they found that in one of the chemical relationships of one of the swabs of the 3 that break down from the single test was faulty, or in some way wasn't reading properly, which negated all of the tests on the swab, the 3 different tests of the breakdown from one swab. And that put the Yanks back, I believe, a month. It was for sure a couple of weeks, but that's a known element of this, that from the time that they realized they really had a problem, certainly in Seattle, that they weren't able to even test anybody for at least a couple of weeks, but probably a month following, because they thought that they would go, trailblaze on their own. So all of these things, Jim, just lead to, again, at least a couple of doctors that I've seen that have just said any sense that a COVID-19 test is in any way worthy of even caring about, because it's so unreliable, that it just makes all of the numbers laughable. It just, the whole thing is farcical to me in terms of like how you can rely on the Chinese data to then look at how the Italian data has just been, the interpretation of it has been eviscerated on many different platforms, have gone into it to see that they're using different criteria in their assessment of the fatalities, certainly. So it seems like it's not just apples to oranges, but everything to do with testing is just like farcical to more ridiculous.
I can forgive the testing because it's a new virus, it's a novel virus. But what I can't forgive is, and anyone that wants to look at what Craig said, I haven't got the article there, but you can just put in CDC admits false negatives, false positives, and you can see what Craig's talking about that. I think that goes back to about 6 weeks ago now. But right. Backing up what you just said now, this is inexcusable for reasons I'll go on to. This is Dennis Campbell and Heather Stewart at The Guardian, and it's doctors threaten to quit NHS over shortage of protective kit. Call for NHS recruits to tackle COVID-19 undermined by lack of essential supplies. Right. And this is last Tuesday, the 24th of March. Wow. Now, one can forgive the testing kits because it's a new thing, it's being rushed along. But however, the idea that the NHS should not have the correct protective gear is, for anything, because you could always get some sort of outbreak or something. You're in a hospital environment where you would want to limit cross-infections as a standard before coronavirus even entered the common vocabulary.
Yeah, totally. Nothing to do with COVID-19.
Damning indictment of the conservative austerity measures. And let me just quantify that with what I call the pro-wrestling paradigm, to say, because I've just taken a pop at the Tories does not mean that I voted for Jeremy Corbyn. Just because I say I love cats doesn't mean that I hate dogs. And so the idea of the whole social media thing of it must be some kind of one or the other, that's not what I'm about. I'm about asking questions from a political atheist point of view.
Sure.
So just because I'm taking a pop at the Tories doesn't mean I was a fan of Corbyn.
to make clear, I have to make clear in what you've just said that all of this we have to realize, not only do they not have proper stockpiles of PPE, which you and I both know should have zero to do with the specificity of this particular threat, in terms of like a biohazard, which is essentially what it is. So COVID-19 has nothing to do with the fact that a modern medical infrastructure should have capabilities for its staff if there's a major outbreak, especially, Jim, I always have to stress this, especially when you are involved deeply and comprehensively in the manufacture and production of both chemical and biological weapons. when you're actually doing that. The fact that on the fringes of your manufacturing industry that you have zero medical societal preparation should there be any breach, of which there are countless breaches. That's a known element of that type of behavior.
I don't think it's zero. I just don't think it's enough. I don't think they have zero preparation. That's not what the nurses are saying.
No, but they have.
It's woefully inadequate.
Yes, they're inadequately equipped, which you and I both know from a biological hazard point of view is enough to be defunct, right? Like, if you're using that mask twice, it's defunct. If you don't have other people in masks to remove your mask at the end of the shift, it's defunct. Anywhere in the chain, any weak point in the sanitary bubble is a complete collapse of that bubble. And that's why I say if they're a little bit under-equipped, it's a complete disaster in that setting. That setting needs literally they need to have like a comedic number of boxes of things to play with, right? Like they need to have that as backup because that's what an outbreak consists of. That's the pressure of the, we could call it the bottleneck that they're trying to prevent in the NHS system by quarantining us in our homes, right? They're trying to what's the expression again? To reduce the
social distancing.
No, reducing the bubble.
Flattening the curve.
Flattening the curve. This is the idea of that, and the only way the curve can be flattened is if you've got medical staff who are in adequate medical equipment, essentially just to protect their numbers, because they're essentially going to be involved in the curve no matter how long it's elongated. That.
Let me load up another article for you to just back up your other point about the nurses being threatened over speaking out about this.
Yes.
Just to back up what you were saying there, allow this article from The Guardian to just load up for me. NHS staff gagged over coronavirus shortages. Doctors and nurses warned not to discuss lack of protective kit, medics claim. And this is from Dennis Campbell.
This is what I was saying.
And this is only Tuesday, the 31st of March. So this is only yesterday. Not only do they not have the correct kit, but they are, I'll read the article. NHS staff have been gagged from speaking out about widespread shortages of personal protective equipment that they fear could risk their lives from the coronavirus, frontline medics claim.
Statistically accurate. Yeah. Yeah. I knew I'd seen it, Jim. I just didn't realize, what the veracity of it was. But I knew I'd gone through that and had seen that there were some
Continue.
threats.
Tactics being used to deter staff from voicing their unease include threatening emails, the possibility of disciplinary action, and in 2 cases, being sent home from work. Some doctors have been giving a ticking off after managers were irritated by material they had posted on social media.
So no different than the Communist Chinese Party. Essentially, the only difference is how they're going to take them off the vine. Whether they're actually going to kill them like the 33-year-old ophthalmologist, as is rumored.
Yes, allegedly.
As is rumored. Allegedly, yes. Or if they're just going to, like they're doing to us, kill us socially, depress us, take away the livelihood of a doctor or a nurse, take away their shifts. How do you threaten people like that? Obviously, they're underhanded and insipid ways, the ones I just mentioned. So I'm being somewhat facetious, Jim, but the truth is, when you tell somebody who is told by their political structure, or their societal structure, or their upbringing that they're free, not just free, but they live in a society that is a paragon of freedom, and then they're told by their middle management or upper management that they're not allowed to speak their mind under threat of their livelihood perhaps being taken away or being struck off, or who knows what they're threatening. That's just it's as draconian as you get. It's what's the difference if you're on the street here or if you're on the street in Belarus? It's not, nobody cares that the name was different on the deed, or the bank that you had that has no money in the account now makes any difference. There's no odds. It's just the same, it's societal factors being manipulated to instill fear, to maintain an untrue narrative. Couldn't be more diabolical, really.
Well, the rich people will have at least the quilted toilet paper, I would have thought. That might make a difference. But speaking of draconian,
yes,
we're currently in a lockdown. Now, I'd like to make it clear, I'm not advocating for or against the lockdown. I'm looking at the facts surrounding it.
Yeah.
This is a fact. This is from the Washington Times, and I'll also put on there a link to our UK government's own website confirming this later when we do that. So do check out my Facebook page, Jim Grant Comedy, or the Cruise Facebook page that this is going to be on. So this is an article from the Washington Times on Thursday, the March 26th. Before lockdown, Britain quietly downgraded status of virus threat. Just days before, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced a nationwide lockdown to contain the coronavirus epidemic, health officials in Britain quietly lowered the official threat of the pandemic, saying the COVID-19 virus did not meet the criteria to qualify as a high-consequence infectious disease. So let me just days before.
Yeah. Just days before the lockdown. Mm-hmm. So in time to not have the lockdown, or have it at least affect the decision to lockdown, they still decided to go forward. And then how many days after was the reassessment by Neil Ferguson from University College London, and his 500,000 souls down to the likelihood of no more than 20,000, if that. There was many magnitudes overreaction, as he unfortunately is famous for doing with the swine flu outbreak. So there's a pattern there, and that's a frustrating element of this as well that I'm sure other people are aware of. There are many different glaring idiosyncratic issue spots, let's say the least. One being that, to my knowledge right now, and you may have the facts there in front of you, we are not even in a particularly high fatality season of flus, full stop. So even with the additional COVID-19 deaths, those that can be associated with it, it still doesn't bring, if those were added to the seasonal flu numbers, the seasonal flu numbers into even a notable year over at least the last 5 years. So we're in a very odd paradox that we're told incessantly that flu deaths are huge and astronomical, and then suddenly something that comes along that really isn't going to touch on anywhere close to an average flu death season in its mortality has got everybody locked in their homes, and that's as well. I must say, Jim, also that I'm knowledgeable in. It's much more, or it's believed to be, its properties are far more contagious. It's at 80% contagion. I think it was early days, and the Lancet was reporting that if you go into a room with 5 people in it and you have COVID-19, 4 of them are going to get it. 80% for sure of contacts are going to contract. And then there's, of course, that fluctuating, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% of people will require hospitalization or ICU, advanced medical care. So that in itself, that's a different complexion. That's not true of a normal flu, and we know that. So there's a chance, and there's a reason why you want to soften the curve, because you don't want your medical system to be dealing not just with the fatalities, which may or may not be much higher than your average flu, but with the people who need advanced medical care, which will be, in all likelihood, higher than those numbers. So we can understand that we don't want that kind of, overwhelmed atmosphere in any hospital, and that's not going to help outcomes of anything, including stubbing your toe or getting falling off your bicycle at the same time. So we know those elements of it are true as well. And another element of it that doesn't get talked about very much, but is true, is the number of people that do come out of the COVID-19 contraction to have experienced it, in the few that are proven through tests or authentic symptom interpretation to know that they for sure had it, to find that there's not uncommonly not just lung but cardiac damage. That's an element too that isn't a parallel with your seasonal flu. So I'd like to lay a groundwork that you and I are both aware and knowledgeable, that we're not spouting off. We're not those kind of people that are just saying that it's nothing and it's the same as a flu, and that there are characteristics of it that are unique and they deserve to be delved into and appreciated. But because of a lot of what we're talking about now, we are seeing that there's non-comparative studies being overlaid with each other as like for like. And that's really clouding any interpretation that you could try and find accurately from this,
For sure. I'm not in saying that I don't think the lockdown hasn't helped to reduce that.
Sure.
I think we're now at the point that we need to ask serious questions, because number one priority is saving life. Yeah. And I think social distancing has helped that.
Sure.
I think the lockdown has helped that. But it's an important question to ask, at which point the lockdown becomes counterproductive.
And more damaging.
Yeah. Damage to food supply.
For sure.
Power supply, the effect of operations being cancelled in the NHS, at which point do we say the lockdown, I don't dispute the lockdown is doing good, but at which point does it do more harm than it's doing good? Yeah. And I'll bring up some articles on that, but it's important to point out at this point, I do believe this virus is nasty.
Yeah.
I think that this lockdown has helped, but I'm now at the point that I'm asking 2 questions. 1, is it counterproductive to continue past the 3-point period? And 2, I need to ask its efficacy, considering that we see the London Underground swamped with people. And please, again, the pro wrestling paradigm, please don't think I'm calling for the London Underground to be shut down, because I'm pointing out that it's... that it could be a place where people get infected, as opposed to people being harassed on the Lake District. I ask whether that... These are all genuine questions that I think,
valid.
As we've seen over the weekend, of police busting up parties and things based on those grounds. Yeah. And again, please don't think that I'm advocating or defending those people partying. I'm asking the questions as opposed this new law comes to our constitutional rights. And people will say, we don't have a constitution in Britain. I think we do. I think we do have the Magna Carta from 1215, from which things are basically coming from that. So
bringing out the big MC.
Yeah, I'm asking. So I'll just bring up something about the London Underground at this point. If you want to, your voice on the efficacy of this lockdown and pros versus cons, I'll bring up a couple of more articles.
Great. Yeah, I think just further to what you're saying, that now investigatively, you've probably seen some things on it. I'd like to get to the bottom of, and where was I thinking of it in what you were speaking of?
Well, while you're thinking about that, the article I've got is just about to load.
Right.
Or at least it should have done. It's an article from the Metro, I believe. It's currently loading.
Yeah.
And I just want to actually read it verbatim because I'll try and do it with a straight face. It's from Tuesday, the 3rd of March, and it's from the Metro. It's by Zoe Druitt, and the headline reads, "No risk of catching coronavirus on the tube, says Sadiq Khan."
Yes.
I'll just go,
Sadiq I remember
Khan
that.
has said there is no risk of people catching coronavirus while travelling on buses or trains in the capital.
Such a knob. Just such a knobaholic. It's just so beyond. All of this has happened, or that was commented on long after the cruise ship had been focused on by the international public, long after several quite high-profile reports had come out on how well the virus apparently does on various different surfaces of study. It's just so far down the road that
it's a basic misunderstanding of how any cold or flu is transferred to anyone, whether it's COVID-19 or anything else.
Exactly.
It shows a real lack of understanding at the most basic of levels.
Yes.
And one must question whether you want a leader with such a lack of understanding in times of great crisis. And again, please don't think that this is somehow an endorsement of anyone else for Mayor of London. I wouldn't even know who
Where to start?
I wouldn't even know candidates coming up in the future are. I have no idea.
But I reserve the right to point out a knob.
Even a small, but no risk of catching coronavirus on the tube.
Of course. I know. It's like the belief that if you lie big, that they won't question it. It has that kind of resonance to it, rather than just like, one of the great things about London, definitely, and England, definitely, almost any place in the world, definitely, is the some tethering of the public consciousness to common sense. It's just like, that's counter to common sense. When you say things that are counter to common sense, it doesn't make anybody feel better about their behavior. It just makes them feel like you're an idiot. And then they can't trust you. It's such a bizarre thing for a statesperson to present in a public forum, and I guess some misguided, and I've seen it defended, I don't know if you have as well, maybe this gives you some insight to it if you haven't. It's defended by people who say that they appreciate what he did because they didn't want him to cause panic. to actually properly inform people with just like the most basic logic on earth is to potentially send them off the deep end. What? What, you can get fucking a flu off a pole on a bus? What am I, 3 again? Is this my mum talking? Like, people are just going to be that ignorant.
It's not just that, but dovetail it into the article I read out earlier about flights coming into Heathrow.
Yeah.
Doesn't the tube service Heathrow?
Yes, it does. Yeah, and that is one of the main vectors for injecting from the most virulent hotspots of COVID-19 around the world into the working heart of London as a city. It's just beyond. It's where it's one of the few places where essential workers are congregating to disseminate their services throughout a vibrant hub of human activity that they're injecting from the airport X amount of times a day. It's again, I've said this before 100 times on social media. It's the case. The idea that they did not want this to be pervasively throughout society, saturating, is as a seeding process from external forces like the airport we're discussing, is just laughable. There's just no. It's another thing that, of course, as discussed briefly earlier in the conversation, undermines the idea that they have some logical explanation for the quarantine, because it's taking place simultaneously. They're two cross purposes. You can't claim to want one and then let the other happen unabated, and that's what they're doing. It's just beyond the effect that you could possibly have by going downtown and licking every bus shelter that you came across, or every lamppost, couldn't possibly be as caustic as what they allow to come into the airport every day. It's just like, the imbalance between the two things is beyond compare.
Speaking of from Sadiq Khan, of a leader who was clearly clueless,
yes,
we'll go to leaders who were clearly not clueless.
Let me interrupt you to say as well. Just let me further undermine this, man, if I may, that you cannot speak out for women and empowering women on Women's Day if you're doing it from a building that has a women's entrance that is functional and is enforced. You just can't. That is one of the huge, great revelations of hypocrisy. And I say this not to do with anybody's religious beliefs or anybody's particular religion, but if you're contributing to the function of a building that has both men and women entrances and enforces women to enter through one, you as a man, regardless of your political affiliations, cannot enter into that building and then pontificate about women's rights. You just can't.
Just to extrapolate, what building are you talking about?
A mosque. Particularly the mosque that Sadiq Khan is a member of. There's no, you can't. I say, I don't know what the ramifications are in Islam if you want to be a broken arrow and pray on your own or whatever, but you cannot empower and contribute to an archaic anachronism, abomination of the past. And you can do it. I understand free worship. I understand that, Jim, 100%. You can do it, but then don't speak about women's rights. That's all. I don't give a shit what, if you go into a building, it's got weird, you guys do some weird stuff, whatever. I don't give no shits. But don't then talk about women's rights. That's all. It's not that complicated. It's just my mom used to talk about it. It's old school. You've seen it here 100 times. It's just for North Americans, Canadians particularly, a younger country, we're not used to men's and women's entrances and exits. We're not used to boys and girls doors. That's a very British, archaic thing in our understanding of the world. So it's not like I only know it from mosques. What are mosques doing? It's all the mosques. It's nothing to do with that. It's just the practice of women not being able to come into the same door at the pub as a man is again, they could be doing it down the street, Jim. I couldn't give a fuck. But don't go there for your pints and then talk about women's rights on another day. That's all. That's all. It's
after this lockdown has ended, will there be any pubs in Britain left?
I wonder.
To show that.
Well, and let me interrupt you again to say on that, Jim, and you already know about it, but it's a powerful thing. It's not just the pubs, of course they might be defunct and blah, 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 but what's missing, what's going to be missing? people with a fucking pot to piss in to go and drink in them. That's what's missing, right? It's not just that the pub doesn't die because they're out of booze. They die because you and I can't stumble down there and have a pint at night. That's what's terrifying about your career and my career comedically, that we are the people that make the people in the pub laugh on a more, simple level, right? And the fact that they're not even going to be there to be leaning on the bar, let alone to like come and congregate to give us an audience. That's what's so, terrifying. Sorry to interrupt what you're saying.
No, what I was thinking, we're approaching around the half-hour mark now. And I'm thinking there's so much for us to digest. I'm thinking
that's pretty good start, though.
Another podcast in the next couple of days.
To dovetail in.
We should cover economic impacts of the lockdown in terms of food supply, medical supply shortages, that kind of thing. Economic impacts. I also want to cover the origin of the virus. I think this is all. So I think that's what we should do for our next podcast.
Nice, I like that. And let me say one thing that I'd like to cover or find out even a little bit more about in the interim couple of days, if we do that, is the mystery of the not very busy hospitals. You've heard about, I'm sure, right?
I've heard about them, but
so I was gonna mention when you were talking about the medical staff in the UK and the PPE shortage and all that it's not happening at all hospitals. That's a curious bit. So
for sure. I mean, I've got friends that work in the NHS that said they're seeing coronavirus all over the place. So I don't think
that's what we got to find out then.
But I think what we can definitely do for our next podcast is looking at the origins of, theories around the origins. And I'd like to point out that they are all theories at this point. It's a novel virus we've not seen before, originating in a government that is known for its dystopic control of information and its citizens. So we're very much in the realms of theories for everything, but we'll look at alternative theories on that, and we'll cover a wide spectrum of that. And I'm not going to be putting forward, here's what I think. I'm going to be putting forward, here is a load of articles I think we should take into consideration. So we should look at that for our next podcast.
Yeah, I've got a few in mind for your origins suggestion as well.
Origins and impacts. I think those are our two things for our next thing, because I don't think we should do these podcasts for too long. But just to round off what I reckon should be our last article of the evening is not every leader around the world, Craig, was as inept about viruses as Sadiq Khan. Some of them knew exactly what the impact of virus would have, at least economically. This is an article from Microsoft News, which I think is reiterating Fox News, I think. Dianne Feinstein, 3 Senate colleagues sold off stocks before coronavirus crash, reports. Senator Dianne Feinstein of California and 3 of her Senate colleagues sold off stocks worth millions of dollars in the days before the outbreak crashed the market. So there you go. Not every leader around the world is inept. They're
Ka-ching.
Money themselves, some of them.
Yeah, what's it worth per body, I wonder?
Who knows?
That's for someone else to work out another time. Pleasure talking as always, Jim.
Yeah, so we should tell people what I think we plan to do. I think we're trying to open up a Gab account, a Brighteon account, which is an alternative to YouTube. We're going to try and put this on as many platforms, alternative to the big boys like Facebook and YouTube as possible, because I foresee a time where the Eye of Sauron regards us, even though all we're doing is reiterating information from the mainstream, I think the Eye of Sauron may decree us to be spreaders of disinformation. So let's think ahead and put it on
too hot to handle.
So my Facebook page, where I'm going to be posting this stuff on, is Jim Grant Comedy. I've also created the Cruise Facebook page.
Nice.
But I'll put that paste on my thing so people can find it there initially. We'll use those platforms initially to put this information out. And a big thank you to you, Craig, because you're going to be doing all the editing.
I realized that as we were talking. I think it's going to be pretty simple, though. It looks like the only thing I was worried about was running out of space or overheating, and it's on my bare legs, and everything's good. So we're off to the races.
So
and I was thinking as well that we might not even make 10 minutes, but now we're at what, probably close to 40. So amazing.
Yeah. So I just want to reiterate to people, we are going to be doing this podcast in the future. We're not going to be here telling you what to think. We're going to be presenting different points of view for you to make up your own mind. And always be wary that the mainstream media were the people that told you about weapons of mass destruction, and there was no alternative to bailing out the banks when Iceland had an alternative option. We're looking at different sources, what's going on here. That's what I'm going to. So thank you for watching. Good, whatever time you're watching here. Thank you for pressing play, whatever time of day it is you're watching. And thank you very much for listening. And yeah.